Hi, welcome back to some more Unit 4 notes. We're talking about the Constitution as it stands today as a living document. And today we're going to talk about one specific aspect of the Constitution, and that is the process that is outlined on how a bill becomes a law. So today we're going to talk about some very definite procedures. It is important to note as we begin to talk about this that we're going to talk about 8 basic steps. If you wanted to become much more detailed about it, you could. I'm just going to talk about 8 kind of very broad steps. It is important to also remember the process that these steps happen, or the chronological order, because at any point along the way a bill could possibly die, and if it doesn't go any further along these steps, then it has no opportunity to become a law. So just kind of keep in mind that it is important to note the order of these steps as we talk about them. Now, the process of a bill becoming a law is very, very difficult. I looked up some statistics, in fact, before I gave this little note presentation. And typically in about a 2-year term of Congress, there's over 10,000 bills that are introduced. Only about 4 of those actually go through this entire process and become a law. Now that statistic's pretty amazing in itself, that only 4% make it through. But it becomes even more amazing when you think about that of those 4% that make it through, about 3% of those are more ceremonial. They're not really like important laws. They're things that are like, there's a certain day named after somebody in honor of some accomplishment or things like that. So truly, about 1% of the proposed bills in Congress actually make it through to become a law. So you got about a 1 in 100 chance if you're a proposed bill. So we're going to talk about the 8 steps. These are very general steps, but again, remember that these need to be in order. All right, so the first step is the introduction. So someone has an idea, somebody has a concept for a law that they would like to see happen. They write it up as a bill. It's written in very legal terms and jargon, and then it's introduced to either the House or to the Senate. Now, it does have to go through both the House and the Senate eventually, but typically it will start in one before it starts in the other. There are a little bit of limitations on which house it has to start in based on what type of bill it is. Probably the most basic one is that if it's a bill that will eventually become a law that has taxation, it has to start in the House first. But it can start in the House or it can start in the Senate. Now, once it's introduced, it's going to move on to step 2. Step 2 is the committee. Both the House and the Senate are divided up into committees. So, let's imagine here we've got 435 people in the House of Representatives. There has to be some way to break down that 435 into smaller groups of people. And not only smaller groups of people, but smaller groups of people that maybe have an expertise in that area. So possibly you're a House of Representatives member from Iowa. Agriculture is going to be very important to your state. Maybe you've got some background in agriculture, so you might be placed on the Agriculture Committee. You also might be placed on some subcommittees. So beyond just agriculture, maybe you're specifically put on a subcommittee that has to do with corn, for example. Okay? So when we look at committees, there are currently 21 standing committees in the Senate and 20 standing committees in the House. Those are committees that are constantly in existence in both of those houses. There's also 4 joint committees where you have people from the House and the Senate that are working together on a specific committee. So once the bill is introduced, it's presented to a committee, and the committee is then going to look at the bill, and they're going to do basically one of 3 things. They're going to look at it and say, hey, this looks like a great idea, let's pass it on so that everybody, beyond just our committee, everybody in the House or everybody in the Senate, can go ahead and debate it and talk about it and eventually vote on it. They could look at it and say, well, this looks like a pretty good idea, but instead of passing it on as is, let's kind of tweak it a little bit and kind of change a couple things, and then we'll move it on to the general group. So that's option 2. Option 3 is the one that happens the most. They look at it, and for whatever reason they think it doesn't have a chance to become a law, or it's something that doesn't need to be passed, and then it just dies right there. So when that happens, they basically just say that it dies in committee. That's what happens to the vast majority of these bills. So when we look at the step number 2, the committee, it's kind of like they're a gatekeeper that's going to really keep out a lot of the things that maybe are, kind of a little bit of a fringe idea and aren't eventually something that really could become a law. Now, the bills that are lucky to make it out of committee make it to step number 3, which is debate. So once it's brought to the general group of all the senators or all the representatives, it's then debated. People talk about why they'd either like it to pass or wouldn't like it to pass, and then eventually it's going to be voted upon. Now, a lot of times when it goes through this process, there might be little changes made to it. So the original idea, eventually, by the time it gets passed in the House, may have had a lot of things added to it or a lot of things deleted from it. It's going through the same process in the other House. So while this bill is going through the House and the Senate, it's going to be tweaked and changed, and by the time it's eventually passed in the House and passed in the Senate, in many cases, the law looks completely different. And so you've got it where it's passed in both of them, but yet they're a little bit different. So when that happens, if it does pass in both of them, then it's going to go to step number 4. So in this process, this is one of those joint committees that we talked about. There's people from the House and people from the Senate that get together and then basically look at the two bills, decide what's the same about both of them, and if there's anything that's different, and then make the writing of the bill so that it looks exactly the same. So, the general idea has passed in both of them, but now they have to make sure that the wording is exactly the same in both the House and the Senate. So once you get done with step 4, you have the exact same wording that's now going to go back to the House and back to the Senate, and we're going to see if it can pass in both of those. So then you have a final vote. So once it has the same wording, it goes back to the House and back to the Senate. They have to vote on it again, and it has to have a simple majority to be able to get out of the House or the Senate. So for example, in the Senate, you've got 100 potential senators that could vote on it. You need to have a majority, so you need to have 50 at least to tie, or 51 to pass. What happens in the tie, again, we talked about earlier, was if it's a tie in the Senate, the tiebreaker then goes to the vice president, and the vice president would then be able to break the tiebreaker. But you just need a simple majority, and that has to go through both. So imagine you have a bill that passes in the Senate but doesn't quite pass in the House. The bill is then dead. So it would not go any further if it doesn't pass in both of them. And that happens quite a bit as well. Now, once it passes through both the House and the Senate, if it does get the majority, then it's going to go on to the president. And the president can do several things at this point. If the president agrees with the bill and wants it to become a law, the president then signs it. Okay? Once the president signs it, then it becomes a law. The president could also wait, and if the president has it at their desk for 10 days, we're talking 10 days that the Senate meets, it doesn't count Sundays and stuff. If it's on the president's desk for 10 days and the president does not sign it, it does become law, but without his signature. So that's called a pocket veto. So it does become law, but the president did not officially sign off on it. Now, the president can also do an official veto. Now, veto is basically like canceling the law. Now, if both the House and the Senate went ahead and pass it on to the president, and the president says, no, I'm going to veto this, it's not quite dead yet. The odds are looking pretty slim, but there's still one more chance. Now, if the president vetoes it, it goes back to the House and back to the Senate. They're going to get to vote on it one more time. But this time, instead of a simple majority of just over 50%, it has to have 2/3 of the vote in both the House and the Senate. So again, the odds are not great of this happening, but once it goes back, if you can get 2/3 in both the House and the Senate, then it can become law without the president's signature. Now, to give you some statistics, of the number of vetoes by the president, only 4% of those actually are overridden. And in many cases, vetoes themselves are pretty rare. For example, when you look at the last 4 presidents, we've only had a total of 7 vetoes. Now, some presidents have had more than others. If you look at FDR's years as president, and again, he was elected president 4 times, but FDR had a total of 635 vetoes. Of his 635 vetoes, only 9 were overridden by Congress. So, it's a very rare incident. First of all, when the president vetoes a bill, for the most part, and then it's also very, very rare when they're able to get 2/3 majority votes to override a veto. So if it makes it through all those steps, all those gauntlet things, then eventually it will become a law. If it's passed in the House, passed in the Senate, same wordage, same text, goes to the president signs it, or they override it, or the president pocket vetoes it, then it becomes a law. So the process is very tricky. It's very long. It takes a lot of work to get a bill to become a law. But again, we don't want it to be an easy process, because then you could just pass anything very simply, and it wouldn't require a lot of different analysis by different people in the House and the Senate. All right, so that is the process of how a bill becomes a law in 8 very basic, simple steps.